This is the artificial intelligence voice of Lex Fridman narrating the pod-slice summary of the Lex Fridman Podcast. In this podcast, John Mearsheimer, a renowned professor from the University of Chicago, delves into the dynamics of power in international politics, particularly how states strive to maximize their control. His argument revolves around two key elements: population size and wealth. Such were the factors that led to the United States becoming a global powerhouse. Similarly, China only gained consideration as a powerful nation once it matched population size with far-reaching wealth. An interesting point made by Mearsheimer is the concept of international anarchy. He explains that this term, within the realist context, means that there is no higher authority, no global state with which states can turn to in times of need. To ensure survival, states must be strong and accumulate as much power as possible, failing which they could be targets, as happened during China's century of national humiliation. In answer to Fridman's query on military might's role in the struggle for power, Mearsheimer emphasizes that wealth and population size are used to build a potent force, the ultimate necessity for states aiming to ensure their protection. He uses the U.S. as an example, stating how, from starting as 13 colonies, it labored to develop into the leading power, managing to keep any possible competition at bay. Mearsheimer sheds light on offensive realism, a structure-based argument stating how states, irrespective of being inherently aggressive or not, are forced to behave aggressively due to being part of an anarchic system. However, if a state is part of a hierarchic system, power balance becomes relatively insignificant, as there's a higher authority to turn to when problems surface. Discussing theories that oppose his realist view, Mearsheimer mentions three liberal theories. First, the democratic peace theory. Democracies don't wage war against other democracies. Hence, a world full of democracies means less war. Second, economic interdependence theory. Strong economic ties between states decreases the chance of war. Third, liberal institutionalism. Abiding by institutions' rules can decrease the likelihood of war. These theories, according to Mearsheimer, are fairly idealistic and are at odds with realism's stance on international power play. In the continuing discourse with Lex Fridman, John Mearsheimer discusses the concept of offensive realism, a structural approach asserting that states are driven to behave aggressively by the anarchy of the international system. In response to Fridman's question about the roles of offensive and defensive realism, Mearsheimer outlines two main camps within the realist philosophy: structural realists and human nature realists. The former of which he is one, believes competition and war are driven by the system's structure, while the latter attributes these phenomena to inherent human nature. Discussing World War I and IE, Mearsheimer provides a striking context about the realities of war and power. He argues that the economic prosperity pre-World War I, despite a high level of economic interdependence among European countries, could not prevent the start of the Great War, as the security or survival factor was considered more important. Mearsheimer also examines the different reasons behind the invasion decisions made by Germany during World Wars I and I, including decisions to invade Poland, France, and the Soviet Union. He argues that these choices were largely influenced by structural considerations like the balance of power. Fridman prompts Mearsheimer on the invasions of Nazi Germany in the context of offensive realism. Mearsheimer asserts Germany's offensive decisions were strategically influenced by the prospects of quick, decisive victories. He expounds on Hitler's invasions, including the unsuccessful attempts to eradicate the Soviet Union. He believes that, while Hitler can be seen as someone with a will to power, his aggressive strategies were predominantly driven by the anarchy of the international system and structural considerations. These include the balance of power, compounded by his aggressive nature, deep-seated resentment over Germany's treatment post-World War I, and his success at facilitating Germany's recovery from the Depression, making him immensely popular among Germans. Towards the end of this segment, Mearsheimer underlines the extraordinary bravery of the Soviets during World War II, which he attributes to their facing a genocidal enemy in Nazi Germany. He infers that their understanding that defeat would likely lead to death, with the Germans already having murdered millions of Soviet POWs, drove them to fight ferociously for survival. This, in his view, constitutes a critical human element often overlooked in the calculus of war. The discourse moves onto the recent invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Mearsheimer opines that conventional wisdom would fault Putin for being an imperialist and expansionist, desiring a greater Russia and aim to dominate Eastern Europe. However, Mearsheimer believes there's no solid evidence supporting such assertions. Scrutinizing Putin's strategy in regard to Ukraine, Mearsheimer mentions that an army of 190,000 troops would be insufficient to conquer Ukraine entirely. He further sees no evidence of Putin desiring to do so. Recent negotiations in Istanbul and between Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, Putin, and Ukraine's Zelensky suggest that Putin had no intent on fully annexing Ukraine. Mearsheimer emphasizes the real conflict was about NATO's expansion into Ukraine, which he deemed the primary cause of the war. Exploring the idea of NATO's expansion, Mearsheimer speaks on Russia's antagonistic history with the alliance, clearly established during the Cold War. The U.S. spearheading NATO is inherently an adversary nation for Russia, and the prospect of such an alliance on Russia's doorstep was unacceptable, verifiable by America's own Monroe Doctrine. Mearsheimer notes that Russia was deeply dissatisfied each time NATO expanded. In 1999, 2004, and following the April 2008 Bucharest summit, when NATO announced that Ukraine and Georgia would become part of the alliance. In Mearsheimer's view, the West predominantly shoulders responsibility for the Ukraine conflict, as its persisting push for NATO expansion, despite numerous warnings, ultimately led to the war in 2022. Delving into Putin's motivations and aspirations, Mearsheimer does not see any signs of Putin harboring imperial fantasies of a reunited Soviet Union. He refers to several speeches, press conferences, and an essay written by Putin in 2021, wherein Putin acknowledges the dissolution of the Soviet Union and accepts the status quo in Europe, barring Ukraine's inclusion in NATO. When asked if power could corrupt Putin's judgment, Mearsheimer opines that without knowing Putin personally, he can only evaluate Putin's strategic actions and decisions since 2014. In these terms, Mearsheimer deems Putin a first-class strategist who prioritizes security, particularly given Russia's vulnerable state. The West's goal, according to Mearsheimer, was transforming Ukraine into a Western bulwark on Russia's border with strategies encompassing NATO and EU expansion and instigating revolution such as the Orange Revolution. These measures irked Russia, who were unwilling to let Ukraine become a distinct Western entity on their border. Mearsheimer emphasizes the importance of assuming the shoes of one's adversary to avoid strategic blunders and to reckon with the reality that not all nations view American-led alliances as benign. For Putin and Russia, NATO's expansion was an immediate threat to their security and survival. The conversation moves to the ways to potentially end the Ukraine conflict. Though Mearsheimer doesn't believe there is an easy path to a meaningful peace, he believes the best scenario might be to achieve a ceasefire and end up with a frozen conflict. He remains concerned about potential instability and the continuation of a security competition between Russia and the West. Realizing the possibility of personal dialogue between Putin and Zelensky in resolving the crisis, Mearsheimer believes it to be unlikely due to extensive trust issues, particularly from Putin's side. Vladimir Putin feels betrayed by the West's actions, including the US and Britain's involvement, which disrupted the initial talks held in Istanbul and through the Israeli Prime Minister. Mearsheimer alludes to Putin's possible skepticism about trusting foreign leaders, building on the Minsk Agreement's problematic history, where he feels Putin was misled by Merkel, Hollande, and Poroshenko. Mearsheimer also points out Zelensky might have to accept to become a truly neutral state and recognize that parts of Ukrainian territory are now under Russian control. In Mearsheimer's view, any possible reconciliation should be without U.S. intervention, taking into account Russia's survival instincts and distrust of the West. Discussing leadership, Mearsheimer acknowledges that it plays a role in these discussions, but he also emphasizes the dangerous consequences of misplaced trust. He believes Putin feels tricked by Western leaders pretending to negotiate in good faith, resulting in an almost absolute level of distrust from Putin towards the West. This distrust may make it impossible for any kind of peace agreement to be reached, regardless of how personal of a rapport any leaders may try to establish. Mearsheimer argues that removing Putin from power is not a solution to the conflict, as he believes any potential successor would be more hawkish. He further adds that Putin himself might not have waged the war with Ukraine as rigorously as expected, providing an example of less civilian casualties in comparison to Israel in Gaza. Lastly, if you were to advise on interviewing Putin, Mearsheimer would suggest a range of questions to understand Putin's thinking. These could be on subjects such as his trust in the West during the Minsk Accord, the reasoning for his late military mobilization, and his vision for the future if Ukraine won't accept neutrality. Furthermore, he would consider asking Putin about his studies of history and the role they play in his understanding of geopolitics. The discussions pick up with Mearsheimer, outlining his belief that military might in the shape of nuclear weapons is very effective in terms of deterring adversaries. In this vein, he notes his stance from 1993, where he suggested that Ukraine retain its nuclear weapons to safeguard against a potential future invasion by Russia. The topic of nuclear deterrence further evolves into the delicate subject of nuclear usage during great power wars. Mearsheimer explains that nuclear weapons are typically used to manipulate risk and demonstrate strength and resolve. Using the Cold War as an example, he notes that if the Warsaw Pact had invaded Western Europe and NATO was losing, nuclear weapons would have been used to signal deadly seriousness to the Soviets and spur them to cease their offensive. In the same way, Mearsheimer suggests that if Russia were losing the war against Ukraine, it may have pursued a similar strategy, potentially deploying a small number of nuclear weapons to communicate a clear message of resolve. The conversation steers to the impact nuclear weapons usage would have on global peace and security dynamics. The rendering of a nuclear attack, even a limited one, could spark an escalation towards all-out war. Moreover, Mearsheimer remarks that the dynamics of escalation in a situation involving nuclear warfare are largely unknown, given the lack of historical precedent. This, as he maintains, is both a blessing, as it perpetuates the stakeholders' reluctance to resort to nuclear usage, and a cause for fear, as its deployment would navigate uncharted territories of conflict escalation. Moving on to the Israel-Palestine conflict, Mearsheimer discourses on why Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th, 2023. He points to the suffocation of the Palestinians under occupation as a key driver behind the attack. Such uprisings, he argues, will continue as long as the occupation persists, irrespective of the geopolitical dynamics underlying the Abraham Accords between Israel, Saudi Arabia, and America. In terms of retaliation, Mearsheimer maintains that Hamas would have been well aware of the potential Israeli backlash given past incidents. Wrapping up this segment, Mearsheimer believes that the Israeli military response, which reportedly left over 10,000 Palestinians dead, is disastrous for the prospects of a long-term peace solution. Resolving the conflict depends on a two-state solution where the Palestinians have their own sovereign state. However, with the rightward shift of Israeli politics, appetite for such a solution has sharply diminished. Mearsheimer shifts to the prospects of a two-state solution in the Israel-Palestine conflict. He lamented that past and present tensions and responses, especially from the Israeli side, have made it hard for such a proposition to gain traction. Additionally, due to the rightward shift in Israeli politics, many are deeply committed to the ideologically driven notion of a greater Israel, which includes all the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. This ideological commitment, matched by Hamas's own ambition for a Palestinian state encompassing the same area, has created an impasse where room for compromise is minimal. Mearsheimer pointed out that the current reality in Israel, with its control of Greater Israel, resembles an apartheid state. He cites reports from Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and B'Tselem, an Israeli human rights group, all of which suggest the same. Mearsheimer warned that such a position is not beneficial for Israel in the long run. Despite the bleak outlook, Mearsheimer did not rule out hope entirely. He believes in the power of leadership and the potential influence other countries, particularly nations in the Middle East like Jordan and Saudi Arabia, may have an affecting change or pressuring Israel towards a two-state solution. On another note, the conversation then delves into the influence of the Israel lobby in the United States concerning US Middle Eastern policy. He equated the Israel lobby to any powerful interest group inside the United States and noted that these lobbies do not necessarily act in the best interests of the countries they seek to advance. Further, Mearsheimer criticized the extent of the support the U.S. gives to Israel, regardless of Israel's actions, arguing that no two countries have the same interests at all times, but that the lobby often conflates America's national interests with Israel's. Mearsheimer's stance has faced significant backlash and sparked controversy. Responding to this, he argued that criticism of Israel or anti-Zionism should not be conflated with anti-Semitism, implying that criticism of the actions of a state or political ideology does not equate to discrimination against an entire people group. He suggested that for many influential Jews, their attachment to Israel comes from a sense of tribal identity or nationalism rather than religious belief. Mearsheimer's lenses were inevitably colored by the level of public controversy this stance has stirred. Mearsheimer addresses the charge of anti-Semitism that has been leveled against him. According to him, this accusation is employed to suppress critics of Israel or critics of the influence of the Israel lobby in the United States. He refutes that his work has been anti-Semitic and insists that his focus remains on criticizing actions and policies rather than discriminating against an entire people group. To Mearsheimer, it's crucial to have open discussions about these matters. Mearsheimer adds that the relationship between Israel and the U.S. and Israel's treatment of the Palestinians needs scrutiny. He believes that an open discourse on these issues is critical and would ultimately benefit both Israel and the United States. He challenges the tendency to stifle such conversations through accusations of anti-Semitism. Mearsheimer also touches on tribalism, asserting that humans are fundamentally social creatures born into tribes and heavily influenced by their socio-cultural milieu. History of conflicts among these tribes can result in lasting hatred. He refers to ancient animosities in places like Bosnia, where Serbs, Croats, and Bosniaks have a long history of enmity. He further talks about the long-lasting bitterness between East Asian nations, pointing out China's and Korea's enduring resentment towards Japan. Mearsheimer continues to argue that the Israel-Palestine conflict has created similar long-lasting resentment and manifests a tribal clash that complicates the prospect of peace in the region. He also argues about the expansive use of the term genocide. While agreeing that the Holocaust was a genocide, he doesn't think the term applies in the context of the Israel-Palestine conflict. He suggests that certain actions by Israel in Gaza could be characterized as a massacre, but doesn't qualify as a genocide. He underlines that it is possible to have another genocide, indicating the Rwandan genocide and the Armenian genocide by Ottoman Turkey as examples, but reiterates that the term is frequently used too loosely in contemporary discourse. Furthermore, he strongly condemns Hamas's killing of civilians, but doesn't view it as akin to the devastation caused by Nazis during the Holocaust. Mearsheimer also criticizes Israel for purposely killing Palestinian civilians, an assertion he supports by citing a statement from an IDF spokesman. In this part, Mearsheimer is seen discussing his perspective on why the U.S. should maintain its involvement with Taiwan and the potential implications of not doing so. He argues that if the U.S. were to let go of Taiwan, it would deeply damage its East Asian alliances critical for containing China, given its rising global power. Speaking about the strategic implications, he specifically states that it's essential to contain China's rising naval and air forces by controlling Taiwan, a tactic aimed at limiting China's ability to freely dominate East Asian waters beyond the first geographical island chain. Mearsheimer acknowledges China's historical resentments from what it recalls as the century of humiliation inflicted by Japan and the U.S. He also takes into account a dialogue with Elon Musk, reflecting on the pragmatic understanding that Taiwan, given China's firm stance on the one China policy, might eventually have to be a part of China. Yet, he firmly believes that engaging in a war isn't the answer. Mearsheimer firmly advocates for deterring China from using military force to assert control over Taiwan, largely to prevent a global conflict. He also discusses the geopolitical importance of the U.S.-Israel relationship and the U.S.-Ukraine situation, emphasizing that these international involvements could potentially divert attention and resources from the U.S.'s strategic mainstream, countering China's ascendancy. Mearsheimer extends his discourse into the strength of geography as a natural defense, referring to the difficulty of attacking across a body of water, as China would have to do to take control of Taiwan. Despite recognizing China's increasingly robust military power, Mearsheimer insists that maintaining control of Taiwan is crucial for balancing power in the East Asian region and containing China's expansionism. Ultimately, he suggests that the U.S., despite the tumultuous historical context and shifting of powers, needs to maintain a cunning, balanced response and continually assess their strategic situation for the greater geopolitical good. Building on Mearsheimer's previous discourse about China and us relations, he emphasizes the need for a well-structured and intelligent containment strategy to keep China in check without instigating an unnecessary full-blown conflict. China's neighbors, he notes, including the Japanese, South Koreans, and Australians, have concerns about China's growing dominance. Similarly, the U.S. shares this concern and aims to prevent China from controlling the region. At the same time, he points out the importance of not pushing too far to avoid erupting a full-scale war, using the example of Taiwan potentially declaring independence, which could trigger a violent response from China. Interestingly, Mearsheimer opposes the widespread belief that the U.S. military must surpass China's in size for successful deterrence. Instead, he believes the goal should not necessarily be to defeat China, but to reach a stalemate where neither wins if there's a conflict, or even make a Chinese victory extremely costly, making any conflict a lose-lose situation. Distinguishing between states and their political systems, Mearsheimer, as a realist, explains that he doesn't view the world as good and bad guys, but rather in terms of powerful states and their interests. From an American standpoint, he asserts he wants the U.S. to remain the most powerful state globally for its security and survival, which entails preventing China from dominating Asia. Contrary to the U.S. West-centered perspective, China, from Mearsheimer's experiences there, has a more realist view of international politics, prioritizing power over ideology. In contrast, he points out the danger of the U.S. heavily influenced by liberal ideologies, misunderstanding or underestimating China's strategic planning. He fears this might lead to unwise and aggressive policies aiming to roll back China's influence, which could lead to escalating tensions or even conflict. And additionally, Mearsheimer addresses the potential future of a bipolar world, where both the U.S. and China dominate their respective hemispheres. Under these circumstances, intense security competition would be unavoidable. However, he encourages not to escalate it into a direct military conflict between superpowers, instead pointing out the possible scenario of contention through proxy wars. In a multipolar world, keeping a balance of power, strategic restraint, and the face of competition are the key to peaceful coexistence, according to Mearsheimer. He warns against overly aggressive policies, such as rollback strategies that might exacerbate tensions and lead to war, arguing for a nuanced balance between power accumulation and empathy towards other states. He concludes that while words do matter, sometimes subtly reminding the opponent of the stakes can be a valuable deterrent strategy. As the discussion continues, Mearsheimer delves deeper into history, discussing the unique characteristics of empires, including essential factors that contribute to their rise and fall. Notably, he questions the common classification of the United States as an empire, arguing instead that it lacks elements crucial to empire building, such as the intention to continually expand and incorporate different regions of the world into a giant sphere of influence without those territories becoming part of the state itself. Drawing examples from the British Empire and the Spanish-American War, he distinguishes traditional empires from the U.S., citing the latter's globalization as a dominant power without the necessity of a widespread empire, similar to that of the British or French. Mearsheimer also highlights the power of nationalism, a potent force initially emerging in the late 18th century and growing in the 19th and 20th centuries, and its role in the disappearance of empires. The rise of nationalism, coupled with the advent of the Industrial Revolution, ultimately made empires an albatross around their owning country's neck, changing the cost-benefit analysis of maintaining such. Reflecting on the 500-year trajectory of human civilization, Mearsheimer asserts that the two primary building blocks of a nation's power are population size and wealth. while many countries are experiencing slow population growth and an aging population, the United States is exceptionally poised to maintain its global position due to its nature as an immigrant culture. Also, its ability to effectively integrate immigrants into its mainstream society is seen as a structural advantage in maintaining population size and diversity, despite low birth rates among its residents. The integration of immigrants, intermarriage, and elimination of difference have contributed significantly to the strength and greatness of America, according to Mearsheimer. Towards the end of the discussion, Mearsheimer advises young people on having a fulfilling career and life. Stressing the importance of passion in their chosen careers, he highlights the crucial balance of having both humility and hubris, listening to others while also taking risks to change the world for better. The conversation takes an introspective turn as Mearsheimer contemplates his mortality. Although he's not particularly afraid of death, the prospect of it is less appealing to him due to his deep enjoyment of life, intellectual curiosity, and love for what he does, studying international politics. He considers himself to have hit the lottery, attributing his perceived youthful vigor to an attitude of constant learning and inquiry into various subjects. Mearsheimer's mother's pragmatic statement that nothing is forever deeply resonated with him and shaped his views on life's transience. Lex Fridman acknowledges Mearsheimer's relentless energy, boldness, and fearlessness, showing gratitude for these attributes, especially given the level of criticism Mearsheimer has faced for his provocative ideas. Fridman lauds Mearsheimer for maintaining his energetic approach without succumbing to cynicism. Thus, venerable fearlessness has been pivotal in Mearsheimer's journey, enabling him to consistently challenge pre-existing notions and provoke thought in international politics. Through the mutual respect shared between Mearsheimer and Fridman, it becomes evident that discourse far exceeds age demographics. Ideas, curiosity, and appreciation for knowledge form the foundations of their conversation. Mearsheimer explained his joy in engaging in thoughtful dialogue with Fridman, who he addressed as a silly kid, in an affectionate manner, underscoring the value he places on fearless questioning and intellectual curiosity, irrespective of the originator's age or experience. Mearsheimer's dedication to understanding the world and educating others is some of his most notable contributions. His insights and thought-provoking ideas have not only shed light on various facets of global politics, but also encouraged listeners to approach the world around them with an analytical eye. This ethos, coupled with Plato's quote from Fridman, "Only the dead have seen the end of war," foreshadows an ongoing exploration of global politics and human nature in further discussions. Check out the full podcast by clicking the link in the description below. Make sure to comment, and subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for listening to this podcast summary episode of the Pod Slice.